Insellmilkom u nilqakom għal programm ieħor Wiċċ imb Wiċċ fejn kull ġimgħa niltaqa' ma' awturi differenti u niddiskutu x-xogħol tagħhom. Illum se niltaqgħu ma' Teodor Reljic. U s-silta li se naqraw minnha hija mir-rumanz tiegħu tu. Teodor huwa kittieb, freelance feature u copywriter, kif ukoll l-editur kulturali u l-kritiku tal-films tal-Malta Today. Ippubblika l-ewwel rumanz tiegħu tu ma' Merlin Publishers. Iżda kellu qatt ta' pubblikazzjonijiet oħra f'Weird Fiction Review, Le Monde Neparon u Film Grant. Attwalment qed jaħdem fuq l-ewwel comic tiegħu, Mibdul, flimkien ma' Ines Kristina, li se joħroġ aktar tard din is-sena. Ngħaddu issa għal qari tas-silta. When it happened, we were getting ready to go. Dad was looking for suntan lotion and a white t-shirt for me, and Mum was finishing her coffee. Dad had gone to buy special coffee the day before, and maybe that's why Mum was taking her time to drink it. I remembered vermilion in the forest yesterday, I tell Mum. We are waiting for Dad in her bedroom. Really? Good boy, Mum says, and strokes my face. What do you think will happen next? I can't think of what happens in between. All I know about is where vermilion needs to get to. Well, I say, words leaving my brain for a second, he needs to find his mum, doesn't he? Mum is up getting stuff ready for the beach, and she's looking sideways to check the weather, and maybe to see what my dad is doing. But then she stops, and she goes down on her knees and looks me in the eye to tell me, I don't know what happens next, Will. I really don't. Isn't that exciting? She smiles a strange smile again, like she's afraid, or like she's been naughty. Dad calls me, or us, I don't know. I turn back to look at the corridor, and I hear him sorting through the drawers. Or is it his suitcase? I turn back to Mum quickly because I want to know what she thinks of what I said about vermilion, because it makes me feel good to know that I understood something about the stories, that I've taken them inside me somehow and made them a little bit mine. But the first thing I see when I turn around again is the coffee cup on the bed, because it stings my thigh when it touches me. And when I look up, I see that Mum is trying to take deep breaths, like a long yawn, and her arm shoots quickly up to her head, and then when she tries to take in a deep breath and looks like she's swallowing an invisible ball instead, she falls on the bed and nothing else happens. She's safe, Dad says. He doesn't say that she's going to be okay. She's stable, he says. I'm not sure what he means, and I think of horses. Dad is sitting in the kitchen with me. We have just come back from hospital. The table is small, and I have to look him in the eye. I was crying all the way back, and even though I didn't want to. And I am not okay with it now. I don't know how Mum does it. I don't know how just by crying she makes all the sadness go away. And when Dad started crying a little bit after we got back home, I cried some more, and now the dried tears are really bothering me. They're like the mosquito stings I get here every summer. Did that mesh keep me from them last night? Another night of no stories. Who will fix the mesh now? What will my dreams be like now? We just have to wait, Dad says. It feels odd that the day just goes on. I can still smell the neighbour's barbecue outside, and our tumble dryer is still working on a load of clothes. Every summer, Dad tells Mum we shouldn't waste all that electricity when we have so much sun here. But she tells him that the weather is too humid. But days in Malta are long, especially in summer. U dik kienet silta mintu. Issa, għandna l-Teodor hawnhekk. Hi Teodor, how are you?
Hi, I'm well, thank you.
Thank you for accepting our invitation.
You're welcome, happy to be here.
So, the past is foreign country. The famous opening line of L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between is frequently paraphrased by the narrator, William, as, the past is another country. Even if the reference is not deliberate, there is no doubt that the images of the country and the past are strongly linked together in the novel. Can you elaborate on this?
Yes, I think what's crucial about that is that the protagonist, what's crucial about the concept or idea that you mentioned just now, is the protagonist, the young boy, William, is confronted with having to process both the past of his parents and the country of his mother anyway, and her country. So that's the central conflict of the internal conflict that goes on inside his mind. And as somebody who has a connection to Malta, but doesn't have the, let's say, information that somebody who's older might have, that actually becomes then part of the drama. Is trying to understand and process both her connection to the country and his mother's connection to the country, and what that can signify for her current condition, and the stories that inform the vermilion stories that inform the parallel narratives form part of the novel.
Yeah. Another powerful and persistent image is that of the sea, which at the end of the novel acquires cathartic value. The sea is where William becomes something else. The motive of wetness, however, is salient throughout the novel, often associated with sweat and the sense of unbearable heat. The milkshake-thick air of Malta, as you call it. Why is this motive so salient? Is it something deeply thematic or an image strongly connected to Malta?
Well, I think it's mostly the latter. I think it's mostly an image that exemplifies Malta for me. But one would hope that at the same time, when when you introduce a motif like that it kind of folds into the deeper themes of it. So we have the texture of Malta that signifies, I believe. I mean, the milkshake thick air is something that always used to strike me, not just when we first arrived to Malta, when I was 7, when we moved from Serbia, but also when we would come back to Malta, even as kids, from holidays to the home country. When you just leave the airplane and you're suddenly struck by the thick air, which previously in Serbia, obviously, the atmosphere is slightly less humid, so you don't feel it as strongly. And that is something that I associate with Malta. Even have sort of positive connotations. There's a sense of, at least in those first moments when you're driving home from the airport, the idea that it's something enveloping, it's strangely comforting. It obviously gets annoying then when you have to deal with it every day.
Yeah.
But this idea of, something enveloping and, maternal, which I would like. And again, the ideas of sweat and wetness and fluids and so on, I mean, there are kind of Freudian connections there that we could extrapolate from the novel, I suppose. I can't say I thought about them deliberately while I was writing, but I think a lot of what constitutes two, I think, comes from that space of something that you don't really think is particularly there, ideas that are particularly there, but they're kind of woven in anyway, because the story is so intimate and so immediate to a kind of universal experience of the mother and child that sort of the themes kind of suggest themselves anyway. So that's what I kind of hope to achieve with that. Yeah.
The structure of the novel can be explained this way. There are two narratives developing in tandem, the story of William and his family and that of the boy Vermilion living in the imaginary Raven's Cove. The link between the narratives is the mother, who in the first narrative is lying unconscious in a hospital bed. With her sleeps the secret that would reveal the two narratives to be one and the same. The resolution comes at the end when William almost literally walks into the world and identity of Vermilion and, paradoxically, cuts the link, I am mine, but Vermilion isn't mine. What was your inspiration for the world of Vermilion, with its wolves, potions, Raven's Cove, and the blue-skinned trolls?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of very deliberate and not particularly, let's say, rigorous adoption of fairy tale and fantasy tropes and so on. I did that because I would think that when William's mother, Elizabeth, would be conceiving of the story, when you're improvising a story like that, you're not really thinking in terms of nuance or originality, or that you are just readapting and recycling familiar tropes. So that was essentially one reason why I did it. The second reason was that because I really wanted to create a contrast between Malta and to create a contrast between Malta with Malta. With the rest, because it's channeling a very obviously bucolic North European, let's say, or Central European imagery as well. So I think it's, because it's a departure in the story, it's a departure both in the narrative and it's a sort of escape, a psychological escape for both of the characters. I thought that contrast would be a kind of, just a refresher for both of them. And that was what sort of underlies all of that. But yes, I think primarily it's because I wanted to kind of make use of that archetypal space and all the implications that go into that.
Okay. One of the questions that might linger on in the mind of the reader after she finishes the novel is why Henry, Mother's former boyfriend, felt he had to tell William the story about the accident. It is clear why the author includes it. It completes the narrative cycle. But what was Henry thinking? Maybe he saw a link between the coma and the accident and felt that the child, William, could communicate this to his mom in some way and wake her up from the comatose state?
Yeah, I think both of the assertions you make there are true. Of course, it does serve a narrative function, but yes, I think essentially Henry hopes that any information would be helpful because Elizabeth's condition, you know, being in a kind of prolonged coma or whatever, doesn't have any there's no direct cure for it, no accessible cure for it. So there is, I think people in that situation would start to latch on to anything they can find to help, which then opens up an interesting discussion about belief, about, well, magic and religion and so on. So if you see that sort of information as a form of magical incantation, I think it becomes quite pertinent. Also, I think from the point of view of desire, I thought it was particularly useful and interesting because we have Henry, who is a former lover, who clearly still has feelings for Elizabeth, and so you have this kind of unrequited, lingering sense of loss and desire that then is is susceptible to the kind of belief that would lead one to think, okay, I can actually revive this person if I help her son find this knowledge. And then you have William, who, in his being so young and vulnerable, would also hope for something to happen by channeling the stories and so on. And that is contrasted, for example, with the father, Victor, who seems just as lost as everyone else, but represses any, if he has any of similar emotions, he represses them in favor of a more kind of practical approach. Let's put it that way. So I thought that, yes, putting those two characters suddenly together would highlight that aspect of the story, because it is about kind of grasping for something to believe in what, you know, operating in a kind of secular, I mean, there's no actual magic happening in the novel, at least there is that ambiguity towards the end, but for most of it, the stories, the fantastical stories are presented as such, of course. So I wanted then to really kind of challenge and push the reader's perception towards that direction. And because also then it investigates the idea of fantasy, of you know, what space is it coming from? We talked about archetypes earlier. Mm-hmm. They served a function in previous societies, in earlier societies historically and so on. And even, you know, contemporary religions that practice to this day, they you know, when you have a god figure, a devil figure, saints and so on. So yes, I wanted to create that space where that kind of, where we can consider these things as having a real potency.
Okay. Now we have these books that you brought along.
Yes.
Can you tell us something about them?
Yes, well, I'll start with I think the one that is the most powerful for me is something that is very familiar to most people, I would think. It's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. There is actually a very sly reference to Frankenstein throughout too, which I'm still waiting for people to figure out completely. Yeah, I think it's, yes, it just, I read it actually not too long ago. Mm-hmm. But when I did, it struck me like a lightning bolt. Mm-hmm. There are no lightning bolts in the actual, at least Frankenstein isn't revived by electrical means in the actual book, as opposed to the film, the film versions, how you believe. Shelley wrote it when she was 19, and you feel this kind of intensity of kind of as if she's writing a fever dream out. And then when you read more about her life, about how her mother died when she gave birth to her, and the kind of intellectual space that she was writing in, how innovations in science were happening, and so on. All of it kind of comes together in a very intense package, which every time I return to it, I find that intensity again. And I think anything I will ever write will have a bit of Frankenstein in it. And then I brought, well, as you mentioned earlier, I'm currently, well, I've written a comic book. It is currently being illustrated. And so comic books and graphic novels are very important to me. And this is Arzach by Moebius, who was a legendary French artist. His full name was Jean Giraud. So he's a bit of a cult figure. And Arzach is something that he also wrote and conceived of himself. It is entirely a wordless comic. And what I find, again, it does channel a sort of mystical journey. It's essentially just a character journeying through a fantastical landscape on what looks like a pterodactyl of some kind. And the illustrations feel like almost like medieval woodcuts or something. They have that kind of power. And one thing I really appreciate about Moebius is that he has this ability to be incredibly detailed in his drawings, but yet still give breathing room and space. In comic books, that's very important. You can be an amazing artist, but if the panels are too cluttered, it becomes a chore to read. But somehow Moebius manages it. It's a very cinematographic use of space, and so that's something I really, and this is again something I really return to. I mean, it's quite short, so you can kind of revisit. It's almost like revisiting a poem or a song. It leaves you open, leaves interpretation open to you. So that's something I find quite special. Next is something that is actually then quite dense, verbally speaking. It's Titus Groan, which is the first novel of Mervyn Peake's so-called Gormenghast trilogy, which deals with an imagined castle society in no particular time period. And effectively, the first novel just describes the cast of this castle, and they have a very ritualized and hierarchical structure. And the plot actually takes on. There is a hint of a plot, which is the new Earl is born, but then it kind of takes you through the kind of castle and the occupants. And it has this weird mix of Kafka and Dickens, and even then more fantastical narratives, which I find very, very striking. And again, I keep returning to it. Then something that actually also is quite close to two is The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, who was an Irish aristocrat who actually inspired writers like Tolkien and H.P. Lovecraft. And Yeats was also a fan. I think they were friends as well. And that evokes a similarly kind of fairy tale space that, unlike Tolkien, which is very much based on mythologizing and heavy world building, it's a lot more wistful. But it has that idea of, like in Tolkien, when the elves are leaving or departing, this idea of, the magic is fading from the world because of modernity, because of industrialization and so on. And it's a sort of Romeo and Juliet story as well. And again, I find that very, very much inspiring. Then a sort of mix between these two, I think, is Angela Carter's The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman. Angela Carter is a landmark writer. I mean, perhaps she's most famous for being one of the first people to adapt fairy tales to a kind of feminist reading, to modernize them. This is something that's now even entered into the mainstream, even in terms of Hollywood and so on, but she was the first one to do it with her collection, The Bloody Chamber. But with this, it's actually, again, a book about a strange future that seems to be set more sort of in Weimar Germany or German expressionist kind space, and it's a surrealist novel in the very real sense of the word. It's a kind of quest by the protagonist to find his lover. It's a bit like a Dantesque kind of Beatrice, but it's set in the strange universe where the Dr. Hoffman, who is his beloved's father, is kind of this evil mastermind. And I find it's a picaresque story, so the plot isn't exactly easy. It doesn't really kind of concentrate on creating a great sort of gripping plot for you to follow. But the relentless kind of imagery of it and the ironic tone is something I really find inspiring. It's incredibly visual as well. And then I have brought something, this is one of the skin shows by Judith Halberstrom, who is now Jack Halberstrom.
Okay.
It's one of the few academic books I actually, bought for myself that I actually read. I mean, it's in mint condition because I had read it a few times from the university library, but I decided I should get my own copy because, again, it's something I return to. It's subtitled Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, and Halberstrom deals with Gothic fiction and Gothic film and cinema, particularly from a gender and queer perspective. And I find it quite interesting because she kind of sets out to debunk this idea that all horror cinema, for example, is misogynistic, and that it can actually create a space for female desire and queer desire. And I find particularly some of her readings of films like Silence of the Lambs and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 to be quite interesting and to kind of get you to think outside of the established blocks, really.
Okay, I think that's all the books. We've come to the end of the interview. Thank you, Teodor, for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
Wasalna fit-tmiem programm ieħor Wiċċ imb Wiċċ, aħna narkom il-ġimgħa d-dieħla ma' mistieden jew mistiedna oħra.